I appreciate very much the opportunity to join this effort, so many thanks to all the organizers, Marcelo especially. And I need my presentation. Thank you. So I will share with you, basically I will approach four aspects in this presentation. The first is about the evidence of associations between poverty and cognition. The second one is about the mediators and moderators of these associations. Thank you. Then the degree of change of these associations through interventions, and finally I will give you some conclusions and future directions in this area. That is a very young area. The first study using neuroimaging technology was published in 2003 regarding the study of poverty. And until today, we have less than 200 published papers. So we should be cautious about this. So I will try to convince you about this need. About the evidence of associations, it's important to understand that if you take in consideration the trajectory of self-regulatory development, and with self-regulatory development I mean cognitive and emotional processes, we can have different positive and negative influences that can change the slope of this trajectory in different ways during the first 2 decades of life. And during this periods of development, nutrition, physical activity and stress regulation are very important to sustain the slope of this trajectory in the expected typical way. So it's important to understand that poverty never comes along, but with other kind of adversities. In this orthogonal axis graph, you have in the left and above in the left the typical protective environment with low threat and deprivation, and on the opposite side, you have the more threatening and deprived environments. So poverty comes with other kind of adversities, so that means that there is a co-occurrence of adversity that we need to take in consideration. Actually, if we analyze through neuroscience, through cognitive neuroscience, different kind of adversities, we can find different patterns of neural associations. Thank you. Plus, anytime we have an accumulation of negative influences, the endocrine systems, so the stress regulation increases the activity, and the immune system is involved. So if you obtain a blood sample in a very poor area, you will find inflammatory markers without any kind of clinical symptom, what is incredible and is a tragedy actually. So we need to consider also that lower cognitive performances in childhood can be associated with lower cognitive performance in adulthood too. This is an association, it's a prediction, it's not causality, okay? But we need to take in consideration this. So in summary, the impact of poverty on cognition is a function of at least 4 factors: the accumulation of risks, the negative influences, the individual susceptibility to adversities, the co-occurrence of adversities, and the exposure time to deprivation. This means the first implication of this conclusion is that it's not possible to support the notion of unique determinants of development, but of constellations. For that reason, we are trying to work in the context of this meta-theoretical model. In each row you have different levels of organizations. For each one we can have for each individual different type of trajectories, and all the trajectories in the different aspects of or level of organization are multi-directionally and interdependent. So we are working in a very complex context of analysis. Regarding the evidence at the neural level, at the structural, anatomical level, income, parental education, and care quality as proxies of poverty are associated in different studies with changes in cortical volume, surface, and thickness, and connectivity in several brain networks, basically in what we call the default network. So the neural networks that are involved in any activity in the everyday life. And this is happening since the first month of life until at least 64 years old, based on the available evidence. These structural changes are associated with performance in tasks demanding executive function, language, reasoning, and learning in general. When we analyze functionally the neural level through, for example, electrophysiological technology, income, parental education, and occupation can be associated with electrophysiological topographic maps in resting states, activity, and auditory brainstem response into speech stimuli between the first year of life and adolescence. And the evoked response potentials can be changed in selective attention and inhibitory control paradigms. When we verify the evidence with functional MRI and functional NIRS, this means we can analyze the neural activity at the same time when we are performing a task. It's different than the anatomical approach. There is evidence that show associations with the activation of different neural networks with demands of phonological processing, associative learning, and working memory. Other evidence show associations with frontal spontaneous activity and functional topology of limbic, somatosensitive, and attentional networks. Remember that the limbic structure are involved in learning and emotional processing. There are associations with selective activations to face expressions, and we have evidence that show that the history of child poverty can increase the amygdala reactivity between the in adults in the 5th decade of life. So purposely I was avoiding to show you some images, but this is very important, this and the next one. Why? In the left side of this graph, you have the correlation between reading score and a measure of connectivity of different networks. And you can see the high SES correlation in the dot line, the red one. I hope so, because I am colorblind. And in the opposite is the blue one. It corresponds to the connectivity in the left temporal network for low SES. In the other side, in the right, you can see the opposite trend. So the low SES kids have better performances related to connectivity when we look for neural resources in the right temporal lobe. This means that if we look neural resources in different areas or networks of the brain, we can find more than deficits, a sort of adaptation activity. And this is very important, because until few years, we were talking about only the left side of the story. And you can see the same in this case for math scores and the activation of a network in different areas, but it's the same. So there are different patterns of neural activation depending on SES. So something good is happening here, because this means that poor kids are not necessarily doing bad, their performances, but maybe they are using other neural resources that we need to explore. Of course, this is not, we cannot generalize this, but we are accumulating this kind of evidence in the last 5 years. So at the cognitive level, we have more than 8 decades of history about evidence showing lower performances in tasks demanding executive function, metacognition, phonological awareness, and episodic memory from infancy to adolescence. And at the behavioral level, we have all the evidence that the educational researchers were doing during during practically the whole 20th century. So we have lower developmental quotients in the first 3 years of life, lower intelligence quotients between 3 and 8 years old ages, higher incidence of learning disorders, specifically in arithmetic and language tests, Lower scores in vocabulary, spontaneous speech, grammar, and communication tasks, so the different aspects of language processing. And higher rates of school absence and lower rates of completed years of education, another proxy to poverty in many studies. What about mediators and moderation of these associations? And I insist, I am talking about associations, not causality. For neuroscience, the volume cortical thickness in frontal and temporal lobes could be mediators of SES and income. In the association of SES and income and academic achievement, the connectivity between frontal and striatum networks can be mediators between SES or income and executive function, and connectivity between hippocampus and amygdala, between SES and internalization behaviors. And of course, stress, epigenetic and specifically of glucocorticoid receptors, so the receptors that are involved in the HPA system, the system that regulates our response to stress, can be mediated stress response and self-regulation. And that's all. So when we go, so we are at the beginning. I told you, this began in 2003. So we are accumulating evidence about impacts and also about modulation. And these are the two main hypotheses proposed by the Kim Noble team about deprivation and stress, and these neural mediators for these different functionalities aspects. So when we go to when we take in consideration the cognitive perspective, we know that there are many factors at the individual and family levels. The developmental disorders can be, of course, mediators too. Many aspects of school context, including teachers, the curriculum, the mindset about what is education or a problem in education, and of course the curriculum contents. And in this case, from the cognitive perspective, the map of mediation and mediators is a little bit more complex, okay? So it's not possible. This means, of course, that it's a challenge, but I am not saying nothing new. Always is a challenge. It's complex, that is not you too, but this means that we cannot propose unilinear causal statements. That is very important. And media and some politicians can do that. So from science, we need to show these kind of pictures to them to help them to be more humble. And if, I don't know if you see that the cognitive skills in this map is only above in the right is only one aspect of all what is happening from the science of learning perspective in this world. So as neuroscientists and cognitive psychologists, we can produce a lot of evidence about the connection between poverty and different learning and executive functions or self-regulatory skills. But we still need to understand how this is functioning in the context, in the complex context of what education means. What is happening in this sense, for example, with in the relationship between each student with their peers, the teachers, and even at the structural level that impose the way teaching activities are running inside the classroom or at the Ministry of Education. All matters. And cognition is important, but is at the individual level. We need to integrate interdisciplinary, and this is the challenge for us. We need to integrate the other levels of organization. And we have troubles because, as all of you know, interdisciplinary efforts are not easy. No, many of us are talking about that here. So what about the degree of change of these associations through interventions? So this is a graph, a theoretical graph proposed by Rami and Rami from USA at the end of the 90s, and I think that is still useful. We have the typical developmental trajectory for cognition, and then the developmental delayed one trajectory. Above it, we need clinical approaches. But between both trajectories, is we have the zone of modifiability. So we can work there, and we can try with different interventions to change the slope of these trajectories. And we don't know specifically how, because anytime we need to design an intervention, we are a little bit blind. We have the evidence, but in each context, in each different culture, the same aspects can function in a different way. Even they cannot function. So if I take an intervention designed in USA, in Louisiana, for example, and I try to implement it and evaluate it in Buenos Aires, probably I will have different results. And maybe, why not? Maybe it will not function. I don't know. So there is an important aspect to take in consideration about the design of intervention. And in the cognitive neuroscience and developmental psychology, mainly in developmental psychology, there are principles, there are authors that propose principles of efficacy to design this kind of interventions. I just suggest you to read this to all of you that are involved in the designing, implementation, and evaluation of interventions. And this is, of course, theoretical based on USA experiences. So we still need to adapt this to each context. So, in summary, the huge amount of evidence we have through the applying of this kind of interventions showed us that it is possible to modify cognition of children from low SES homes or poverty homes through different intervention strategies. In our team, in our lab, we ran 8 interventions through different ways, working with parents through play, working with teachers through curriculum adaptation, through exercising executive function activities, and so on. So we are still, because we are looking for the mechanisms, the potential mechanisms that could help low SES children to overcome the low performance we see in the baseline evaluations. And there is something important. Changes are not the same for all participants because of the individual variability. That is very important because we need to change the design each time we find some kid that was not affected by the intervention. So it's not easy. Second, these changes have been verified at different levels of organization, neural, cognitive, behavioral, and for ages during, and for the first 2 decades of life. And this potentiality of change questions, at least, the attribution of immutability of the impact of poverty on cognition. This is very important for politicians too. So being poor as a kid doesn't mean that you are going to lose your life, or you will become a mental retarded person, like many people in my country through the media are saying. And of course, on brain structure associated with self-regulation, reading and learning skills. I want to tell you that we only have in the neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience realm, only less than 5 interventions published using neurotechnology. Of course, in cognitive psychology, we have hundreds. And I invite Jeff and Hero to talk about the RCT that Kim, Noble, Duncan, and you are working on, because it's the first time of this species of interventions. All of us are waiting for that. So, some conclusion on future directions. First, poverty is associated to diverse cognitive outcomes at different levels of organization. The most sensitive systems should apparently are executive function, language learning, and stress regulation, everything actually. Differences between deficit and adaptive mechanisms should be explored in the next years with cautiousness. So we need a new generation of studies. We need to take care about the global value of the evidence because of the cultural influences of different kind of poverties on development in different places in the world. So what is happening in taking consideration that the neuroscientific evidence in poverty studies, the 83% comes from USA, okay? So we need to take in consideration this problem. The associations are modulated by several individual and contextual factors. It is not possible to sustain a notion of early unique determinants and trajectories. There is a need of consideration of specific factors related to educational systems, such as funding, governance, infrastructure, and others. This is related with the graph in which I show the complexity of the educational process and system. We need to identify mechanisms based on different type of adversities. So for the moment, material deprivation, emotional threat, and socio-cognitive stimulation are the candidates we are, or the ones we are more analyzing in our studies. It is possible to modify this association through intervention, as I told you, so cognitive sciences contribution, but of course cognitive science contributions still need translation to specific school activities. So based on our results in neuroscience, we are not able to suggest advice about what you can do inside the classroom based on this evidence. If you need that, you should talk with cognitive scientists and educators, because they know how to explore that. But there are some areas that are candidate to explore this, such as nutrition, sleep, physical activity, stress regulation, self-regulation, and motivation. These are the main targets we are taking in consideration for the next generation efforts. Of course, we need interdisciplinary and cross-sector efforts, especially in low and middle income countries. The situation in our countries is very bad to make any kind of interdisciplinary effort. I know that some of you were working in South America, but it's not easy to talk with teachers or with the Minister of Education or the staff at the Minister of Education when you belong to a lab with the neuro prefix, okay? So we are rejected, so it's another, this can happen also in other South American countries. This is a way that for fostering networking, for example, we are running now, the community of neuroscientists working in poverty are going to launch a network in which you will find the literature collection that we were accumulating in the last 20 years. And you will be able to contact each one of them, okay? This is a project to make a closer relationship with other sectors. Of course, I suggest all of us, but especially for the neuroscientific community, we need to identify who are the high-risk groups to work with. We need to identify targets, mediating factors, and type of adversities with more efforts. And of course, we need to foster debates on cultural relevance of terms such as development, learning, childhood, and now what is school, what is education, and indeed what is science. Thank you for your attention.